Everyone, welcome to an IDB panel on the security of our hemisphere. We're going to have an important conversation today on U.S. foreign policy and the southern border. I am Sabrina Warner, IDB Program Director. And for the friends and family of the IDB, hello and good afternoon. And for those of you who are new to the Institute for Defense and Business, just a little bit of background on who we are. We are a nonprofit education and research organization that brings together disparate communities in academia, the government, and the private sector, and to discuss important topics, just like the ones that we're actually going to be discussing today. So I'd like to pay special thanks to our panelists today, and Dr. Navin Babbitt, our moderator today, who is the chair of University of North Carolina's Peace, War, and Defense curriculum. And last but not least, Clark Streets, our very own IDB program associate, who has worked really diligently on putting this together. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Babbitt.
Thanks, Sabrina, and welcome to everybody for this panel. I'm really excited to be a part of it, and we have a great group that are here to discuss security in our hemisphere, U.S. foreign policy, and the southern border. Before we get started, I just want to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. We have Dr. Anthony Bryan, who is an expert examining security issues, energy policies in Central America and the Caribbean. He has been studying these issues for some time and has quite a bit of experience in this area. We also have Ambassador Patrick Duddy, who served as the ambassador to Venezuela from 2007 to 2010. And he was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, who is currently at Duke University. We have Dr. Chelsea Estancona, who is a professor at the University of South Carolina, who is doing research in the political economy of rebellion and criminality, and looking at how price shocks may affect the power of these particular groups. And finally, we have Patricio Proventina, who is director of the International Center for Journalists, who is here representing himself, and he's an expert on how technology affects democracy, the media, and journalists in Latin America. So the way the panel will proceed is that I will allow each of the panelists to speak now for about 5 to 6 minutes. And after they're done speaking, I will start to ask them some questions and we can have some discussion. Largely, these have come from questions that all of you have submitted. We'll go in alphabetical order. I will turn it over to Dr. Bryan.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Well, when I originally joined this, agreed to do this panel, it seemed that the focus of discussion would have been Central America. And the fact that the border of the United States, of course, is impacted very heavily by that Central American migration. Now, that is perhaps a crucible for larger foreign policy questions as far as the United States is concerned. But just to reflect on Central America for a minute, the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, they are struggling with high levels of poverty and inequality, widespread public insecurity, and very fragile democratic institutions. These conditions have worsened over the past year. The coronavirus, hasn't helped. It's in fact decimated a number of the countries. The pandemic, they've had 2 hurricanes in the last year. The International Monetary Fund estimates that the Salvadoran economy has contracted by almost 8.6% in 2020. And the Honduran and Guatemalan economies by about 8% and 1.5% respectively. So things are not good. And amid these challenges, the Northern Triangle governments are not your best examples of governance. They're very fragile. They have sought to undermine anti-corruption efforts, actually, weaken judicial independence, they've consolidated power. And in the view of many analysts, this is a situation that certainly cannot continue. It's deteriorating, to be quite frank. As far as the the push factors are concerned, that is the thing that push people out of Central America, and the pull factors that attract them to the United States, we have to realize that there are root causes for that. The socioeconomic conditions, natural disasters, public insecurity, and general state security because of the gangs that control a number of these economies. And in particular, governance. While the governments have tried to address the region's difficult socioeconomic and security conditions and respond to natural disasters, they've had a very long history of autocratic governance. They don't have enough wherewithal to dedicate resources to the public sector. Corruption is a very big issue in Central America. In all my time in Guatemala and in Honduras, I have experienced it and seen it up front. So public investment is very low. More than that, when you divert scarce resources, criminals are able to co-opt state institutions. We talk about, alternatively governed spaces. We talk about that in Latin America all the time. And you could bring it down to Jamaica and other places where there are sectors of the society, both in land area and in populace, that are controlled. They're differently governed. The central governments can't do anything, so that these gangs, given the power that they have, are able to control most of the environment. So this brings me to the fundamental question that maybe we should be considering. And that is, what else should the United States expect? Now, if given a choice, I think most Central Americans would stay where they are. But when you're faced with unending poverty, your healthcare systems are non-existent, the schools are poor, you have no meaningful opportunities, well, the sanctuary of the United States wins out, to be quite frank. That the United States is a pull factor. These elements are described as push factors. And where does that leave us in the US? Well, I think something that I've said over the years, probably since I was a graduate student, is that a new foreign policy vision for the region is needed. One that fosters partnerships. Yes, higher levels of investment are good, but this is not a problem for the United States alone. There has to be something in which maybe allies from across the world are brought in to the mix. In other words, the foreign policy of the US in this part of the world has failed to match the ideals, has failed to match strategic interests. And both of these things depend on a very stable and secure hemisphere. I'm going to leave it at that, Dr. Bapa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brian. We can now go to Ambassador Duddy.
Well, first, thank you very much. And Dr. Brian, I think you set the stage for our discussion exceptionally well and clearly. I'd like to make a number of points about the US policy, and I'm using the term advisedly, both to some degree domestic and foreign, as it concerns both the southern border and migration. The first thing I'd note that as recently as earlier last month in August, the Washington Post, not an outlet that is notably critical of Democrats, opined that President Biden needs a coherent strategy for the border. and essentially says very clearly they don't have one. The Post, moreover, states very frankly that the border is increasingly out of control. They say it just as flatly as that. Now, I know that there are those who would argue that is not the case, but I've also written effectively the same thing for the Journal of the National Interest. It is out of control by any number of measures, but if we only take numbers, apparently so far this year, we've already seen more than 1.1 million undocumented migrants. In June alone, something on the order of 190,000 people were detained. And these numbers represent, at a minimum, a 20-year high. Right? And this is significant in part because along the border, domestic and foreign policy effectively collide. Right? The Biden administration entered office hoping to conduct a more humane foreign policy on the border and a more humane migration policy. State governments along the border have complained that the form this has taken has been essentially to open the border, to abandon enforcement along the border. This is something we can, I suppose, to some degree debate. But one of the things that I think that Dr. Bryan alludes to, and that the administration has recognized, is that there are tremendously important push factors, and there are obstacles to addressing those factors, which derive in part from the dismal state of the economies in the Northern Triangle, the pervasive corruption among the governments of the Northern Triangle, the relatively weak democratic institutions and judicial sectors, rampant human rights violations, criminal violence, etc. These are important factors, and Vice President Harris, when she visited Central America a couple of months ago, underscored that the US hoped to be able to address those factors going forward. The Biden administration hoped to address those factors. That said, she never talked about enforcement, and part of what is causing particularly sharp divisions between the border states and Washington is the concern in those states that our borders be controlled and that undocumented or illegal migration be stemmed. I would suggest that, first, by way of preamble, just to note that the determination of the Biden administration to implement a more humane migration policy, or a policy dealing with what they are increasingly calling irregular migration as opposed to undocumented or even illegal migration, is a relatively new position for the Democratic Party. It's worth noting that, for instance, during President Obama's administration, more people were deported than during President Bush's administration. Right? And any of you, our viewers who would care to do so, can certainly find video of President Obama, Senator Feinstein, Senator Schumer, and others, all speaking adamantly about the need to control migration, to assure that that migrants enter the country legally. Over the last several years, and particularly in the wake of and during the Trump administration, the issue of what to do about the border, I think, has become, in many respects, more political than it has ever been in the past. And positions divide much more along, if you will, conventional party lines. My particular concern is that at the moment, in what I believe the administration is calling its, in a recently published paper or released paper that came out in July, their intention to implement a collaborative approach to managing migration. That increasingly what we're seeing is a tendency to conflate categories of migrants and to effectively ignore the reality that there are still regulations, laws that dictate how the border should be managed. In particular, what we're seeing is in some of the most recently released documents, a tendency to assume that the vast majority or a significant portion of all of those flowing north are in fact legitimate asylum candidates. And much of the public debate in the United States has revolved around providing opportunities for people to apply for asylum. In point of fact, I think most studies of the communities moving north would underscore that for the most part, these migrants don't meet the standard, the US standard for asylum, which involves an individual fear of persecution for one's race, religion, ethnicity, or political ideas. Right? So this is in fact an obstacle to both managing, I think, migration along the border more effectively, and as well as communicating with our neighbors around the hemisphere, which generate much of the migratory pressure on our southern border, but also elsewhere. Indeed, one gets the sense that there are those in the administration who are, in fact, conscious of the gap between US law as presently written and their perspective on the migrant community, because they've begun using a new term, as I suggested earlier, irregular migration, avoiding, if you will, the notion that migrants who enter without documentation are in violation of US law. Speaking in terms of domestic political tensions, this in fact, I think, is at the heart of at least some of the conflict that we've witnessed and that occasionally plays out in the media in the United States, as people are convinced the administration does not wish to enforce US immigration law, but rather to address the humanitarian concerns of the migrant population. And again, I would say there is evidence that that is the case. The problem is, as we have seen recently, that the Supreme Court and other judicial authorities still evaluate some of the proposals of the administration in terms of existing law. Right. So, a first and important consideration for me is that we need an overhaul US immigration law if we're going to make real progress in some of these areas. I'd like to come back to Professor Bryan's point too on needing a strategy. You know, it's not just the southern border, which is an issue, or which is generating a refugee problem. Haiti has had a presidential assassination, an earthquake, and and a hurricane just in the last few months. The pressures in Haiti are strong. We've seen, if not unprecedented, extraordinarily broad protests in Cuba, and that has once again generated a certain outflow.
That's certainly true. Ambassador Duddy, if I could interrupt, I think we need to pass it on to Dr. Ancona. We can come back to this in the discussion.
Let me add just one more statistic. We're not yet addressing, but I think the region will eventually have to address the fact that we have arguably as many as 5 million Venezuelan refugees to deal with in the hemisphere now as well. And that was going to be my final point.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Duddy. So now let's turn it over to Dr. Chelsea Ancona.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Dr. Babbitt, for the initial introductions. I'm going to do a very stereotypically academic thing and center my initial comments around my research interests. So specifically, as Dr. Babbitt mentioned, I have work about international price shocks to commodity markets and how this then impacts the actions and behavior of violent groups. And so this, may seem a little further afield than what Dr. Bryan and Ambassador Duddy have given us as an introduction, but I would argue that it's not. So to put some proper nouns, I guess, on this, a little bit outside of Central America, but looking to Colombia and the Colombian Civil War, and specifically thinking about price shocks to cocaine in the United States. And so we can think about these as being driven by fluctuations in seizures, fluctuations in demand. And it may seem as if, what is the connection there to, of course, what we see on the ground? But what we see, in fact, is that these organizations like the FARC, so larger rebel groups, larger cartels, but also smaller organizations and smaller gangs, or even unorganized sort of groups of criminals, or at the time rebels, were impacted by these shifts in, at the time, what was an immensely important illegal commodity to the conflict as well as to the region. And so specifically, we see that for cocaleros, or for those who are growing coca in particular, the impacts of these changes in prices at the international level can be really, really quite horrid. So if these are farmers that are in some way involved with a criminal organization or the FARC, we can see consequences as the price drops and these groups become more coercive, more violent towards their economic partners. But we unfortunately also see implications of this as the price of cocaine increased, where we'd see that then the Colombian state or paramilitary organizations were in turn more violent against some of these farmers. And again, I'm using the case of Colombia because it's most familiar to me, but we could think about this in Central America or in the smuggling routes that we see as well. So these changes in price in the markets for commodities that these illegal groups are interested in aren't just like the large sort of producer level. This isn't just about cartels like the Zetas in Mexico as well. So this can be about really small organizations seeking for, expanding and contracting control over smuggling routes that are going to be dictated by how valuable these commodities are internationally. And it's not just about, really awful things like cocaine, right? So we have examples in Mexico of thinking about the growth in avocados in terms of the price of avocados in the international market. So as we saw places like the US become really interested in avocado toast, I guess, we saw shifts upward in price. And that's a business opportunity, right? So these organizations, these criminal groups that historically we might have associated with, really violent homicidal actions, as well as access to, again, illegal markets, see this as well as an opportunity. And so even when we see fluctuations in legal markets, we're going to see detrimental responses for farmers, certainly. This is something that state security forces are going to struggle to deal with. in part because this is by nature hard to predict, right? So we can sort of see some of these trends. The example of avocados, we could see how that was continuing, and we could sort of estimate when that might taper off. But in particular with more volatile commodities that may be impacted by things like rainfall, climate change, shifts in demand that may be based on trend, that's hard to predict. And when you're already dealing with numerous security challenges, this is going to lead to some gaps in how well you can protect civilians and how well you can prevent these groups from becoming stronger in the future. Because the more money you gain, the stronger you're going to be able to be. So that's one area. I would say another thing that I work on that is, I think, relevant here, and I'd like to address a little bit, is work on paramilitary organizations or pro-government militias. And we can think about this as sort of the long-term after effects of conflicts in the Central American region. So if we look at El Salvador, if we look at Guatemala, this is particularly relevant here, that even decades after these insurgencies and these civil wars, we still see the lingering effects of, in particular, state sponsorship of paramilitary organizations. And so these groups during the conflict are well-trained, they're well-equipped, they are able to really present a sort of cohesive threat, both to civilians and, again, of course, to rebels at the time, but also eventually to state forces. And what this means is when the war ends, so when we have sort of a formal termination of conflict, unfortunately, those groups don't have a lot of places to go. So we see this as, sort of these bands of individuals that, again, are well-armed, well-trained, their skill set lends itself well to criminality, and in turn lends itself well to violence. And some of my work shows that this isn't just like the 3 years after conflict, these are decades-long implications of civil wars, in particular where those sorts of groups have been present. And so even if we're not looking at current sort of state sponsorship of violence against civilians, that can still have super lingering after effects. And that can be something that, again, those states themselves, so El Salvador and Guatemala, are not going to be well equipped to continue to manage, and may require a stronger security response given the weight of this problem, given the technology that some of these organizations are still able to access, again, some of the training as well. And then the final thing I would say is it's a little bit further off sort of a field. Work on offshore financial centers and what we might consider to be tax havens. And the reason I bring this up is to get us thinking a little bit about just how long-term and how powerful some of these criminal groups really are. So I think we have a tendency to think about them as local violent actors. And for the sake of thinking about security, I think that is a good and right thing. But we should also be thinking about where do all of their investments go and how are they able to sustain themselves for not just a year, not just 2 years, but again, for a decade or longer. And we want to think about, where is their money? And oftentimes it's hard for us to monitor this, particularly as there's advances in international banking that make secrecy a little bit easier. And so I think we have to, at times, even in a security-driven response, think further afield, because really, these are the sorts of things that lead us to still be asking some of these questions about the Northern Triangle, about Mexico, about this region that we were asking 10 years ago, 15 years ago, except now we're on a much larger scale as we deal with added threats from things like climate change, from the proliferation of smaller criminal organizations that are trying to also fight over these markets, from things like increases in femicide and responses against marginalized groups in these regions as well. So I think we have to think about some of these bigger drivers, but also then realize that some of the implications are at that much smaller human security type level.
Thanks, Dr. Arsincona. Let's turn it over to Patricio Provedino.
Thanks, everybody. Great presentations, and I think Dr. Bryan stole some of my thunder on push and pull factors, but I think is a good presentation overall. I was asked to specifically talk about the international development component of all of this, and I wanted to speak specifically to the interim national security strategy document that was mentioned in the introduction. I think that document very correctly identifies sort of the underlying push factors driving migration, and it clearly states that it says it's human insecurity, poverty, violence, and corruption. I would add to those factors also I think those factors are exacerbated by a small group of ruling elites that ignore the needs of the population, as well as very weak democratic institutions, strong executive branches, very broken justice systems, and no respect for the rule of law. In Spanish, there's a famous saying that's allegedly said by former President Benito Juárez in Mexico that says, "A mis amigos justicia y gracia, a los enemigos la ley seca." And it's translates into English as, "For my friends, justice and grace; for my enemies, the rule of law." So I think that that's very applicable to everything that's going on in Central America, with small groups of elites trying to control and hold on to power, both economic and political, at all costs. I also wanted to mention there's a very recent Woodrow Wilson Center study that talks about development assistance in Central America, and particularly under the Obama-Biden administration. The study, focuses on the Obama administration's response to the last mass migration of minors to the U.S. in 2014. And I think that policy in particular acknowledges prior U.S. and international development assistance failures. It essentially acknowledges that while we addressed some critical issues, like water and other infrastructure issues, we really did not get to alter any of the structural deficiencies like poverty, low investment in education, high levels of insecurity, corruption and impunity, the social exclusion and inequality, as well as the lack of economic competitiveness and access to jobs for people. So this was a $2.6 billion investment in Central America that had a lot of support, bipartisan support in Congress, and it focused on three areas. One was democratic governance. The second was citizen security and economic prosperity. This was a shift in prior U.S. development policy. So I think there was also some interesting observations from the Woodrow Wilson study. One of the experts quoted said that the most important factor limiting growth and social progress in the Northern Triangle was the resistance to anti-corruption and good governance reforms from a small yet powerful group of political and economic actors interested in maintaining the status quo. I would also add that these small political economic actors were very, very intelligent, and they were able to pay very high priced lobbyists here in Washington to defund and discredit the work of both the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, as well as the OAS backed mission to support the fight against corruption and impunity in Honduras. These two commissions, by the way, were very successful in uncovering systemic corruption, and they had some pretty large cases that are still having implications today, including some of the ties that were discovered of the president of Honduras, who is directly tied to narco trafficking organizations. His brother is now sitting in a U.S. jail. I would also say, unfortunately, the Trump administration, while they kept the focus on migration, did not really focus on the anti-corruption side of things, which I think is the central issue here in Central America. I would say, the administration maintained some of this foreign assistance problems, briefly cut it off in 2019, trying to pressure Central American governments to cooperate on migration. I would argue that is not necessarily an effective strategy, especially because, for the ruling elites of these countries, migration is a release valve, and the more people that leave, the better for them. So they really don't have an interest in maintaining or controlling migration. Then I would say, we're lucky that Congress and the bipartisan support for this policy was restored in 2020. And I think what you see coming out of the Biden-Harris administration is really a continuation of that policy that is focused on trying to address some of the underlying conditions in Central America. This is going to be a long-term, investment. We're not going to see, a reaction that happens right away. And I would also say that I would argue that the current wave of migration that we're seeing is also, as Ambassador Duddy mentioned, a failure of our immigration system that has not been reformed since 1986. So with that, I'll leave it open for questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry, my camera cut out there. So I wanted to actually start the discussion. And first of all, thank you to every one of you for your really insightful comments. This was really great to see and to hear and to learn from. But I want to start off with just sort of to have you all reflect on something that Patricio said, which is if we take a step back, right? It's often talked about that there are these causes for migration, like gangs, like violence, like corruption, et cetera, right? And this is coming from some of the questions that were asked prior. What are the causes of those, right? So if we just take a step back, is it just this part of the world has endemic corruption, but there's probably some reason for that, perhaps like the imperial legacy, et cetera. So I wonder if you could just talk about what might be causing the emergence of some of these systemic problems that we keep observing that might be in a sense, the push factors out of this area.
All of the above. Let's start with that. And I wanted to thank Ambassador Duddy and, of course, Patricio and Sakuna for having opened up the discussion a bit more. When I say all of the above, I mean that there is no single cause, one size doesn't fit all. You discover reasons in Guatemala as opposed to reasons in Honduras. It's a mix. And if you go to the Caribbean, you start talking about Haiti, but we know in the Caribbean a lot of what drives the Haitian. Right? That's you're talking about I don't want to introduce race necessarily here, but in the Haitian case, you're talking about a country that beat the hell out of the French, and established independence. First Black republic in the Americas, and they've paid a tremendous price for that.
I think that's reasonable. So please do introduce race. I think that's totally good.
No, in that particular case, I mentioned it. Just going along with what Patricio made an important point about the intentions to have justice in Central America. Patricio, you remember CICIG, don't you? And the accomplishments of CICIG in bringing several Guatemalan presidents to trial. Actually, they were arrested by a very good friend of mine, who is a security expert in Trinidad. Now, the point there is that when it got close to home, Jimmy Morales made sure that CICIG died, and that's one of the regretful things. The same things happened in, of course, when you start talking about Honduras, that they don't intend to let international bodies as such. In the case of CICIG, it was sanctioned by the Guatemalan government, if you remember, but it was an independent authority. And that sort of thing is a real problem. When you can't zero in on corruption issues or that sort of thing, and you have no judicial way of rectifying that. So that's the thing that strikes me as, Navin, one of the factors that drive. Some of the issues raised by Sakuna are very important. In the Caribbean, we are dealing with all of these. This is the point. Climate change for small islands. My God, that's that's at the top of my agenda. I'm doing a study for the governments of one of the regions just for that issue. And certainly the fact of gangs and drugs and so on. So depending on the region that you're looking at, all of these things can be amplified, and they have a certain amount of, what should I say, they're doing efforts to mitigate them, but sometimes those efforts, as you are well aware, all of you know international relations, as you're well aware, those are somewhat out of the realm of possibility sometimes. Let me end by just saying something. one of the best examples I ever heard of the problems of Mexico, let us say, because I studied the Porfiriato. And Porfirio Diaz was reputed to have said about the problems of Mexico that Mexico tan cerca a los Estados Unidos y tan lejos de Dios. You know, that's the problem. So near to the United States and so far from God. That's how we summarized it in the 19th century. Go ahead.
Would anyone else like to add to that?
You know, I'll only make one very brief comment, and that is that Dr. Bryan's citation underscores something very, very important, which is that the pull factors, relatively prosperous North, the availability of basic services, exercises a tremendous pull on the poor and the disenfranchised in Central America. That's inevitable. When in fact the messaging from the US government seems to suggest that people will in fact be received, that the default position for the current administration is to bring many of these people into the country and to give their request for asylum serious consideration. There is, I think, and I lived in Central America for a long time, there is interest in effectively trying your luck in the North because circumstances at home are so dismal.
Well said.
Go ahead, Patricio.
Yeah, I was going to add that I think another pull factor is prior migration networks that have been established here in the United States, whether it's folks that fled Central America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or even the Mexican folks that are already here. So there's people are going to come here if they have family members, if they have a place to stay, and it's hard to battle that. I think disagree with the ambassador in saying that. The vice president was in Guatemala, and one of the first things out of her mouth was "Do not come north," and that is the message that she's been sending in Central America from day one. I would also add that it's really hard to address the current crisis if we don't fix the current immigration system and our asylum system, which was extremely defunded under the Trump administration, and all the local organizations in border states that used to receive migrants did not have resources for when all of this started happening a few months ago.
Yeah.
I think one of the rewarding factors is that the Biden administration, I think, is implementing what I would call a multi-pronged approach intended to address the challenges. By the irregular migration, as Ambassador called it, from the Northern Triangle. You want to cater to short-term or to deter short-term migration flows with public messaging campaigns. You want to do that. But the Biden administration, it seems to me, has deployed the USAID, for example, Disaster Assistance Response Team, to the Northern Triangle, to scale up emergency food assistance, income support programs, all that sort of stuff. USAID has been doing, I think, a very good job. Of course, the administration itself has committed a lot of funds to resolving this issue. And I hope that, given the degrees of US senatorial and legislative process, that somehow or the other, those funds could be granted, whether they're part of a bigger package or not. Something has to be done. Because the bottom line, to me, has always been, if you think other regions are important to the US, you better start looking south. You better start looking at Central America. You better start looking at the Caribbean. Those are where the problems are. Less in the Caribbean, obviously more to Central America.
So just an extension of that question, is this just an issue of money? Is it just providing more aid to these states or grants or whatever it is? Because that's been happening for some time, and yet the result is fairly similar. So again, just to think about this, when aid is distributed, does that shift market patterns? Does that maybe incentivize some actors to, not necessarily to come to the United States, but does that cause disruptions to these societies?
Patricio hit the nail on the head when he talked about the people who came before. This process is an ongoing one. Once you have established communities in another country, those communities will be fed, okay? And hopefully, now I agree with Ambassador Dadi completely that you need a reform of the immigration system. It has to be regularized in some form or fashion. The way it is now, it's not doing anybody any good. But at the same time, it has to take into account these push and pull factors that we've been talking about. That is going to continue ad infinitum. I don't see that with it. The United States is a nation of immigrants. You know, my own country in the Caribbean is a nation of immigrants. It goes on, whether it's regularized or it's not, you know, it goes on.
So you want to go ahead?
Sure, yeah. To sort of tie together, I think your initial question, Naven, and this most recent one, I think just, you know, more money thrown towards the problem is probably not going to be a real solution here. You know, so if we think about, you know, you asked initially about root causes and where does corruption come from? And we have a lot of chicken and the egg problem going on here, of course, but you know, we can take this all the way back, I think, to, you know, the roots of colonialism and the roots of economic imperialism, right? And so these are long-standing structural economic issues that mean that the provision of even what might seem to be fairly well-established, like agricultural aid programs that are not just meant as Band-Aids, but are meant as longer-term, I think, economic incentives, there's still the plausibility of these being sort of subverted, I think, by corruption, by, you know, ruling elites in various sets of these countries. And so I know, or I would say less about exactly how we fix that problem, but I would be sort of adamant that even, you know, emergency humanitarian aid, when we think about, you know, the consequences of these hurricanes, that's pretty easy for a lot of these armed groups to get a hold of, which prevents it from getting to people who need it. And then in turn, as I was saying earlier, sort of furthers the power of some of these groups. So I think we have to be really careful about not just providing, you know, sort of material aid or financial aid of any sort, but also coupling that where possible with, you know, sort of more locally driven security solutions around this that are going to try and be kind of monitored in a way that allows for more efficient long-term application of that aid. And increases, you have to do kind of both at the same time, right? So it can't just be US-driven security solutions, I would say. I think it also has to be, how do we protect the interests of local businesses and allow them to grow and allow, you know, people that might otherwise be really pushed, as some of these factors are we've been talking about, but instead provides opportunities for them to stay and be safe and develop that way.
If I can just add one other point, I think all four of us have suggested, certainly implied, that what we recognize is that addressing the problems especially in the Northern Triangle, but elsewhere as well, is generational, and to some degree is related to but distinct from the problem of the border per se. It seems to me that the administration has begun to elaborate a strategy for Central America. I'm not convinced yet that it is the right strategy, but I agree with Dr. Bryan that we need one. I'm not sure that, notwithstanding your objections, Patricio, that we've sent a clear message to the border, to the residents of Central America about U.S. attitudes toward irregular migration. My own sense is, which was also in something that the Washington Post suggested, that telling people not to come while relaxing controls at the border sends, at a minimum, a confusing message.
I'm confused by that because the Biden administration continues to deport people coming in through the border. So
Yeah,
I'm not
that's
sure that
exactly right. And
we're
there've been-
necessarily relaxing the border as a lot of folks in the media are saying that we are. So I just wanted to add.
I think that's a great point, by the way. That's a great, and the Biden administration has taken heat for that.
Yeah, but they're continuing to deport folks. So it's, you know, I'm
They're
not
getting
sure
heat from both directions.
Well,
I'm not sure that you can say like they're relaxing the border when they're continuing deportations. To me, relaxing the border would mean no deportations at all and figuring out how to deal with people coming across the border once they arrive. And that's not what's happening.
No, and I think to think about this, an interesting question is, I don't think there's any illusions that deportations are continuing, as Patricio says. Perhaps there is a belief that it's not as bad under Trump, but given the structural conditions and given the gangs and given the the effects of climate change for sure in the region, you're still seeing flows in, right? Which I wonder if you all could comment. Does this mean that people are so desperate that the cost of staying where they are is just awful, so they have to come despite these risks? And if that's true, what would be a policy solution for that? I mean, solve it overnight, right? But what do you think would be some things that could be potentially done if that's the set of incentives that people have?
I mean, I think the answer to your question on why people take that risk, and I think the risk is extremely high. People are putting themselves and their lives at risk crossing deserts and dealing with criminal organizations all along the way as they cross from Central America to Mexico. So I think the level of desperation is shown in the fact that they're migrating. I would argue that, international development and international aid is one tool that we have. There are several other tools that we can use. The U.S. Embassy has very, very strong sway in Central America. What the U.S. ambassador says has ripple effects on the political and economic elites in Central America. We also have sanctions that we could use. Also, a lot of money that is stolen from Central America ends up parked here in the United States. And it gets invested in Miami and in other places. So, I think there are other things that we can be doing to address this problem and to put pressure on political decision makers to start shifting in the right direction.
I mean, if I might have a go at the answer,
Please.
Let me put it this way: that you have evidence that foreign assistance can alleviate, some drivers of forced displacement. You have that, such as violence, food insecurity, economic migration. These things are linked to very long-term demographic and development trends. Okay, they have nothing to do with just the border. I always had a problem with President Trump and this focus on the border till I found out he wanted to build a damn border because he could profit from it, the wall, so that I think that sometimes let's look at some real ways to try to manage migration pressures. This is only in the near term. Why don't we create US pathways, let us say, for temporary laborers, for asylum seekers, while working with partners throughout the Western Hemisphere to strengthen, as it were, humanitarian protection systems. So there should be a comprehensive regional framework to manage migration flows. Ambassador Duddy raised an important point, and that is the fact that we seem to be segregating or compartmentalizing, the migrants. But I think it has to be done. It has to be done. I am old enough to remember, perhaps Ambassador does as well, the bracero system in the United States. Okay? In other words, people designated to come to do labor for a particular, they went home every night. In other words, they took the relevant wherewithal, the largesse that they made working in the States back to Mexico, and they kept coming back and forth. So it was it was under heavy criticism at the time, but it is something that was certainly orderly, and it was well managed. Now you have an informal part of that going on, let us say between Tijuana and San Diego, or between other border countries, border cities. You have it between Laredo and Nuevo Laredo. People move back and forth all the time. And so it's disciplined and it's handled that way. But I don't think there is much, correct me if I'm wrong, those of you who know, I don't think there is much in terms of Mexican illegal, immigration to the United States. It's Central American. It's not Mexican. And this is, as far as I'm concerned, evidence that somehow or the other, things can work. They can be managed. You manage these crises, you cannot solve them. That's the title of one of my books, actually, Drugs, Guns, and Cash. How to manage the Central American crisis.
I think you're correct that net immigration from Mexico is zero.
Yeah, just about. Just about. Thank you very much.
Correct.
Well, let me ask, I think every time I talk, I go out. Let me ask one more question because we have about 5 minutes left. The question I have is, so if it has to do with development in the region, right? So what's been happening, I think, for the last several years is we're starting to see alternative investments come into the region from China and from Russia, which are not the traditional investments coming in from the United States or aid packages. So I wonder if you all could comment on whether or not you think that this has potential to be a positive investment for these for this areas, or the stereotype is that these investments are all negative, that it's going to harm the economy, et cetera, that this has a drag. But I wonder if the problem is trying to build the economic resources of these countries, even if this doesn't come from the United States, could this potentially be of benefit?
I take a shot at that. It's happening in the Caribbean with abundance. It's happening in Central America. I fully endorse it. All right. And I think that one has to understand the Chinese. The Chinese do not think in terms of 5-year administrations or 4-year administrations. They think in terms of generations. They know what they're going to do. The road pattern that they're talking about, to unite countries on this. That's a long-term vision of China. It doesn't depend on whether there's an administration in Washington for 4 years or not. They think in terms of generations. That's what they do. That's why they're winning this game globally. And a lot of the world just hasn't woken up to that realization. You think the Chinese president being there for life is just a joke? No, it's not a joke. Is it anti-democratic? It might be. But the guy is there representing continuity for China's foreign policy. And that continuity, as I say, is a generational thing.
Does anyone want to add to that? Does that potentially, again, is there a negative externality here, right? But if this makes things better, maybe it keeps people there, but is there something negative? Dr. Scone, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. This is probably going to be an incredibly pessimistic answer to what might have been a sort of hopeful question. And I think from less of a kind of grand strategy standpoint and looking at, China's aims or Russia's aims or really any other country's aims here, I think if we think about it as more localized impacts of like multinational corporations investing here, if I'm the owner of a firm that is going to maybe be building a plant in Honduras, and my options are to trust in the state to protect me and assume that my assets won't be seized, or to perhaps build partnerships with local criminal actors and trust that by getting them on my side, I'm also unlikely to have my assets seized. These are both options that could feed into either state level corruption or into furthering the strength of these sort of illicit actors that we care a lot about stopping in the region because of, again, all of these sort of negative externalities around violence and those push factors that we were talking about. And so I don't see it as necessarily this sort of nefarious, like China and Russia are engaging in large, grand strategic moves against the US. Could perhaps be the case, but I think our biggest danger here is in not being able to secure some of those assets or make sure that that then funnels into strong long-term legal development.
Chelsea, I endorse you. I endorse that.
No, this is not a simple question. In some countries, the very dramatically expanded trade with China has tended to increase those countries' dependency on the export of raw materials. It has been relatively infrequently the case that Chinese investment has encouraged sort of vertically integrated economic development. But at the same time, 12, 13, 14 years ago, as the world went through its great financial crisis, it was the trade with China that helped Latin America emerge from that global crisis more quickly and in better shape than would otherwise have been the case.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, so we are at 2:59. So I guess this would be, I don't have time for a 1-minute question, but I do have time to thank each of the panelists for spending some time with us to help us learn about the region. I learned a lot, so thank you all very much. And I will conclude here, and I can turn over to Sabrina if she wants to say anything more.
I don't know where she is, but I'd like to thank the IDB for having this very good initiative. Excellent.
Thank you all for such a fantastic panel. And thank you, Dr. Babbitt, for moderating. So have a great afternoon, everyone.